Thank you, and my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this conference, the topics of which can only be described as timely and critical. I'm showing you here an animation depicting the continual movement of the planet's tectonic plates. The animation covers a time period between 1 billion years ago and today. I'm including this clip to remind you that our home planet is not, as we so often assume, a stagnant place. It is geologically alive, restless, and dynamic, and on occasion, in a time frame much more familiar to us, that ongoing dynamism results in the sudden and often destructive forces that we call earthquakes. Throughout history, earthquakes have caused both loss of life and considerable damage and destruction of our material heritage, both movable and supposedly immovable. This presentation will review the approaches to both determining the seismic vulnerability of collections, the movable contents of museums, and the approaches to the mitigation of damage that can be applied long before the earthquake strikes. My time is somewhat limited, so my comments will by necessity take the form of a general overview. There are essentially two starting points that lead to the effective damage mitigation for collections: a reasonable understanding of the likely seismic hazard, and a greater awareness of the vulnerability of any given collection to that hazard. With reference to the first, we should note that while large damaging earthquakes are not exactly common, there are locations on the Earth that are far more seismically active than others, places where the occurrence of an earthquake should never be termed a surprise, perhaps despite our all too human tendency to ignore such threats and our willful ignorance about them. As you have recently and quite unfortunately been reminded, Croatia is one of those active places. This is a graphic catalog of the relatively recent seismic activity in Croatia. It's a lot. Widely available and updated hazard maps, such as these three, can provide a sense of the likelihood of earthquakes in any given region. These, from left to right, depict return periods of 95, 225, and 475 years. You can see that the probability of damaging earthquakes occurring becomes greater as one looks further into the future. But these maps are based in statistics, and as you well know, nature is not inclined to always follow statistics. If one would have referenced only the map for the 95-year return period, slightly over the lifespan of an average person, one would not have expected the December 2020 earthquake to have been followed so soon by two significant and destructive March earthquakes, only a day apart from each other. So when we try to define the likelihood of an earthquake hazard, there's good reason to be cautious and use data that reaches further into the future, especially when our goal is to protect invaluable cultural collections. We need to embrace, not to avoid, the bad news. To fully characterize the likely earthquake hazard and the threat it poses to collections, a multidisciplinary team is required. Conservators, curators, designers, and technicians such as mount makers will require the input of seismologists, engineers, and architects to fully understand what should be expected and then to better gauge the vulnerability of collections. However, the majority of objects in any collection don't respond directly to seismic ground shaking. Rather, they receive the earthquake forces indirectly through the building and the exhibition fixtures, such as display cases, pedestals, or shelves, all of which can either amplify or reduce forces. So a full understanding of the response of the building and these fixtures is just as important as predicting how the ground might shake. And that too requires a multidisciplinary team of blended expertise. Once the hazard is defined, the next step is to evaluate the vulnerability of the collection. That is to say, the ways and the degree to which the objects might respond to earthquake-induced motion. That ultimately defines the risk level. Now, there are many ways of collecting this data and organizing it. For example, by degree of vulnerability, by value, or by object type, are just three examples. What they all have in common, however, are four basic response modes. The objects will most likely respond by moving with the building and remaining unaffected, or be damaged due to transmitted forces. The objects may rock or vibrate or swing if they're suspended. Perhaps in those modes, they might be damaged by accompanying pounding while rocking. The object may walk off the edge of the shelf or pedestal and fall to the floor, or perhaps collide with another object. The objects might experience sliding, or perhaps be damaged by sliding off the edge of a shelf or pedestal and then fall to the floor, or perhaps slide into another object causing a collision, or they might swing and collide with another object if they're suspended. And finally, the objects might overturn and be damaged by impact, or may fall from a suspension hardware due to the fatigue of that connection. In the last three modes, the object's response might lead to damage of other nearby objects by collision. And it should be noted that response might be influenced by the way the object is displayed or the way it's stored. In addition to determining response modes, the vulnerability survey should include the assessment of fragility. Defined here as the likelihood of damage to the object due to inherent material characteristics or alteration of the object caused by deterioration, repair, or restoration that has weakened the original fabric. It should also include the fragility of parts that extend from the object and are particularly susceptible to damage. I also want to note that for brevity, when I refer to object, I'm including not just the individual artifact or work of art, but also object display assemblies, such as objects attached to pedestals or bases, and also the pedestals, exhibition furniture, and cases themselves. Which response mode an object may enter is largely determined by two inherent characteristics: the location of the center of mass, also known as the center of gravity, and the aspect ratio, also sometimes termed the slenderness ratio. The center of mass is a theoretical point where all the forces acting upon the object are focused. The lower the center of mass, the more stable an object is. Now here, the word stable refers to the object's resistance to rocking and overturning. The aspect ratio is simply the relationship between the dimensions of height and width arrived at by dividing the smallest footprint dimension by the height, base divided by height. The larger the aspect ratio, the more stable an object is. There are numerous methods of determining these characteristics, and increasingly they involve digital scans of the object analyzed by computer programs such as finite element analysis. However, such resources and expertise are not often available to museums, and it's worth noting that both the center of mass and the aspect ratio can be generally arrived at through the creation of simplified geometric models analyzed through often tedious, but not necessarily complex, basic calculations. It is also the case, however, that stability evaluations benefit from the application of common sense. For example, If you were asked which one of these three models would be least stable and most likely to overturn, you'd be correct in following your intuition and answering the middle one. A quite useful tool in quickly evaluating stability is the stability graph, which can be created by seismic engineers using the peak acceleration and peak velocity data of the most likely worst-case scenario earthquake for a specific site or building. You see here the one developed for the Getty Villa, which divides the potential responses of objects into three fields: stable, rocking, and overturning. These are based on the aspect ratio of the object or the object assembly. These graphs are a convenient way to generally assess and then categorize objects based on their potential instability. It should also be noted that objects can be stable, but damaged by non-structural elements within the exhibition or storage environment. Lighting fixtures, ceiling panels, signage, false walls can fall. Lighting grates or suspended glass shelves within cases can fall and crush objects below them. These too need to be considered in any vulnerability survey. I want to insert here a short note about the value of documenting and sharing the records of past earthquake damage. Such information is highly valuable as an empirical guide to future efforts, and I refer you here to the contribution to this Congress by Jurek et al. Regarding the in situ documentation by a number of generous museums almost immediately after the recent earthquakes. I think we can all learn a great deal from such information. Once vulnerability to the expected earthquake is gathered, and the museum has determined the degree of risk it is willing to accept, mitigation efforts can proceed. I only have time to generally sketch some basic concepts, but they will serve nonetheless as an introduction. There are essentially three general approaches to damage mitigation for collections on exhibit or in storage. One can adjust the aspect ratio or the location of the center of mass. One can restrain the object from motion, or one can allow restricted motion. There are advantages and disadvantages to all three. Adjusting the aspect ratio and or lowering the center of mass by providing a wider and or shorter pedestal, or attaching the pedestal to a larger and heavier base will decrease the assembly's tendency to rock and overturn, though it may still slide if it's not fully restrained. You can see here, after the calculation of the equivalent block on your far right, how attaching a wide plate to the assembly on your in the middle has made it much more stable. In fact, it acts like the equivalent block on the far right. And here, how doing the same to these two models, adding weight to the model in the middle and adding weight plus a bigger footprint on the far right, has moved them to the stability field of stable from the field of probable overturning. One can only wonder then why we see this situation in so many museums located in seismic zones across the world. In both of the first two cases I just mentioned, where objects are restrained, the object must be sufficiently robust to withstand the earthquake forces, and the mount must be robust enough to increase the resistance of the object itself. And finally, the mount must fully support or suspend the object and resist on its own any motion due to the earthquake. There are, of course, many approaches to restraining objects themselves. For example, the application of small amounts of wax to stick smaller objects down. However, they should be avoided on porous surfaces or easily stained objects unless a barrier coat is locally applied. Tying objects down with monofilament or the installation of form-fit clips, paying special attention to avoid abrasion and assuring that the areas where the clips are placed is robust enough to withstand the earthquake forces, is another option. Or one can attach the object to custom-made form-fit, what are called contour mounts, that support and restrain the object while also providing additional stiffness and strength of the assembly. Form-fit contour mounts are normally made of stainless steel or brass, depending on the stiffness and strength required. The use of plexiglass or perspex is limited only to smaller objects due to the lack of strength of either of those plastics. And we should note that the same restraints mentioned previously can be applied to object assemblies and exhibition fixtures, such as this pedestal being secured firmly to the wall. Now, another approach is to allow the object to slide in response to the earthquake motion, and it's an effective response as long as there's sufficient displacement capacity. That means room to slide without sliding off the support or colliding with something else. A common approach to it is to attach Teflon pads to the bottom of pedestals or cases, thus essentially letting the earth slide under the object. This interrupts, though does not completely eliminate, the transfer of forces. Caution must be exercised, however, to assure that there's a consistent level and texture to the floor plane or to the support plane. Base isolation systems, an example of controlled sliding and decoupling, are increasingly being explored by museums for individual objects or group of objects, and even for whole buildings. However, the necessary characterization of all the parameters mentioned in this paper is essential for the successful use of this technique. That avoids ultimately increasing the threat of damage rather than reducing it. And it must be added that costs can be quite prohibitive. I would be remiss not to mention that objects in storage are not immune to earthquake forces. All the principles described so far apply, though restraint of the objects is somewhat easier since there are fewer display aesthetics to be concerned with, although of course accessibility is still a concern. Objects can be tied down, padded for protection, nested in form-fit open containers. Open shelves can be enclosed with removable netting, and larger objects can be tied to structural elements of the shelving units or to the walls themselves. In conclusion, allow me to confess to you that I broke one of my cardinal rules by giving this presentation. That rule is that I would never present this type of information unless I had more than a full day to do so. There are far too many critical concepts to fit into any amount of time less than that. But the response of the Croatian conservation community to the recent disastrous earthquakes and the community's firm resolve to avoid the same degree of damage in the future and in future earthquakes needs to be supported by any and all means. I hope we can look forward to more opportunities to explore, exchange, and expand on more needed and critical information. But in the meantime, I refer you to the reading list, which we somehow will get to you, and which includes several of my own books, not only for more detail, but also to encourage more research and increase sharing of information. Either way, I hope this short review has been a useful contribution to your efforts to reduce damage to cultural collections in the next and the inevitable earthquake. Thank you.